I had a hello everyone. I had when I was writing my speech, I had a kind of a joke in here. You kind of look to your left, look to your right. Maybe you'll find an undercover police officer. I have to I I have to wipe that from my speech. But in all seriousness, the fact that we are able to make this Congress happen despite everything that has gone on today is an act of resistance. So, and I want to say to Germany, to the state media who have infiltrated our spaces, you are an embarrassment to the world. The international community does not take this country seriously. The international community sees how complicit you are in genocide. And with that, I'll start my speech. May marks 76 years since the Palestinian Nakba. 76 years of colonization, of forced exile, 76 years of refugee camps, of occupation, of apartheid. However, next month also marks 76 years of resilience, 76 years of a struggle for liberation. The Palestinian political and revolutionary thought developed despite extreme circumstances. For how can a singular people derived from one history and have different realities, whether they exist in the camps of Lebanon, in Gaza, and in Kuwait, all agree on the principles of liberation and identity? Analyzed by Edward Said, we Palestinians are struggling for our self-determination, yet we have no place, no physical terrain on which to conduct our struggle. Said says in The Question of Palestine that we are Arab and yet not simply Arab. We are exiles and yet tolerated guests in some countries of our exile. We can speak at the United Nations of our own problems, yet only as observers. On no national group has its oppressor spoken so long and loud about its political and cultural non-existence, even while this non-people demonstrates, declaims, and fights its oppressor daily. We exist, yet fail to truly exist. It is through this dichotomy in which the definition of what it means to be Palestinian was formed. To be a Palestinian means to exist despite ... Despite efforts at our annihilation, despite efforts of our displacement, and despite efforts of our silencing. I'm not going to speak about the history of the Palestinian struggle as Dr. Salman Abu Sitta plans to highlight it effectively over the course of his presentation. Instead, I want to tell you about I want to tell you about a motif in my favorite story, written by Ghassan Kanafani. In his novella, Men in the Sun, Kanafani concludes his novel with the death of 3 Palestinians who paid a smuggler to take them from Iraq to Kuwait in hopes of a better life. Instead, they died hiding in a water tank under the blazing sun at a routine checkpoint that took longer than usual. Their lifeless bodies are then thrown in a garbage heap. As the smuggler drives off, he asks, "Why didn't they knock on the sides of the tank? Why didn't you knock on the sides of the tank? Why didn't you say anything? Why?" Many, including myself, have interpreted this ending of the novella as a plea to us by Ghassan Kanafani to not forget our liberation struggle and focus on our own selves and safety as individuals. He wanted us to break the chains of individual thought and instead aim to not be passive about our situation, about our exile, and about the genocide taking place against our people with our tax dollars. The end of the novella was a plea to demand your reality as a Palestinian to change, to stay, to face the brunt of state repression, to say something, to knock on the sides of the tank. Last year, I gave a speech here in Berlin on the question of whether Israel was a democratic state, especially since there were these pro-democracy protests going on at the time. What I said then, and what I will say now, is that Israel is unequivocally a fascist settler colony ever since its inception. My family's village of Jimzu in the Lid district of 48 Palestine was ethnically cleansed on July 9th, 1948 under Operation Danny. Lieutenant Moshe Dayan, who then became Israel's defense minister, gave the order to conquer all of Lid and Ramla and all of the villages that inhabited the region. Moshe Dayan's intentions from the start was to depopulate Jimzu and the surrounding villages, quote unquote, torching everything that can be burned. My great-grandfather, Hebh Jamal, sneaked into his village after the military operation was over. He recalled that the remains of dead people were scattered all around the village, unburied. It's as if their bodies was dismembered by wild dogs, my great-grandfather said. My great-grandfather made it a point to remember Moshe Dayan's words. And in fact, he read Theodore Herzl's diary when he said that the process of expropriation and the removal of the poor Arabs must be carried out discreetly and circumspectly. And we made it to a point to remember how the Jewish National Fund went even further by destroying our homes than planting trees on top of our cemeteries. Quote unquote, it must be clear that there is no room in the country for both peoples. If the Arabs leave it, the country will become wide and spacious for us. The only solution is a land of Israel without Arabs, the director Joseph White said. Last year, well before October 7th, I wrote that the call for genocide has always been said out loud. It has been just masked by a neoliberal facade because democracy and freedom was working for some. Well, now what we have seen is that Israel has entered its final stages of fascism, conducting a genocide against 2.2 million people. Israeli fascism is no longer discreet nor circumspect. Rather, it is loud, violent, and televised. The destruction of my ancestral home of Jimzu 76 years ago and the murder of 33,000 people exists from the same political thought, ideology, and colonialist framework of today. However, I have to be honest, I did not anticipate the sheer horror of what is taking place both in Gaza and here in Germany. Later on in the conference on Sunday, you will hear the stories of my husband and his family who are trying to survive the barbarity of this genocide if they are not already murdered. One of the people who he will speak about is his cousin Sema, who he lived with. Sema Abdel Hadi was murdered on February 9th in her home in Deir al-Balah. She was She was killed alongside her brother, mother, grandfather, and 20 other members of her family. She was someone I cherish deeply. At only 14 years old, Sema wanted to see the world. She wanted to be a doctor. She loved little kids and took care of my son Malik the whole duration of our stay in Gaza back in 2022. To have the mental capacity to understand that her life was cut short due to the German-funded bombs, and at the same time not be able to say that Israel does in fact murder children like Sema is almost too much to bear. Never in my life did I expect the possibility that contextualizing, explaining, or protesting the realities of the Palestinian people could be a criminal act. See, in 2008, when Germany decided to categorize Israel's national security as their reason of state, it preemptively signed off on the murder of Sema and 14,000 children like her. This country turned into the propaganda wing of the Israeli state itself, and it did not need the infiltration of super PACs and lobbies like how it exists in the US to do so. No, see, what happens in Germany is that Israel solves a unique problem for the German state. A country that killed 6 million Jewish people during the Holocaust now needs to emerge and prove itself to the free world as reformed, changed, and democratic. Instead of facing their history of colonization and the politics of dehumanization that made the Holocaust even possible, they took a shortcut. Agree and support unconditionally everything a foreign state says and does, if that state claims to be representative of Jewish people worldwide. In order to do this, to take this shortcut, to believe in the mission of Zionism, they first have to silence, censor, sideline, and criminalize the Palestinian identity in ways no other country except the state of Israel have done before. We are a pesky nuisance that gets in their way of their tactical response to the Holocaust, which is, of course, material and ideological support for Israel. This state instead aims to control Palestinians and pro-Palestinian activists and people and suck them into the world of condemnation politics, a clear trap that we cannot fall into. They're not asking you to show empathy for another people. It is an attempt to silence, censor, and obstruct conversations that lead to the liberation of the Palestinian people. Words become dangerous, protesting becomes dangerous, attending a Congress becomes dangerous. Even Jewish people themselves become dangerous if they question, criticize, and fight back against Israel and demand their identity not to be conflated with Zionism, a political colonial ideology. We've seen this week the targeting of our fellow comrades in Jüdische Stimme whose bank accounts were frozen by the Bank Berliner Sparkasse and the latest attempts to sabotage this conference. It is here that I want to thank my Jewish brothers and sisters who are fighting alongside us in the pivotal and historic moment in our collective history. This McCarthyism is creeping on every single one of us. This morning, I was informed that the police wrote a report about me due to my invitation to this Congress and included my work as a journalist in my social media posts on and before on October 7th, attempting to contextualize and explain what was happening around us. But for this police state, context is the enemy. But what gets me is that they had to scroll. The police had to scroll through hundreds and hundreds of posts detailing evidence of Israeli massacres, posts about the reality of my husband's family, posts about their murders, about the destruction of our home, posts about the raids and bombings of hospitals, schools, and infrastructure that exists in Gaza, to be able to make their case, to be able to write this document. They say, while I don't say anything clearly anti-Semitic, quote unquote, this is in fact what I do mean. And of course, it is the idea that I'm aiming for the destruction of the state of Israel. As a non-German speaker, my German vocabulary is more advanced than some. I don't know how to really go to a grocery store and talk to a server, but the words that I do know, Volksverhetzung, Existenzrecht, and of course you can't forget, Anzeige, the one that we, a lot of here get. Yeah. We laugh, but it is an incredibly concerning the level of insecurity that this police state has, that the most basic resemblance of free speech can feel like a threat. On Friday, when I was at a protest and when it was over, I quickly realized that on my way home, I was being followed by undercover police. I demanded to know why they were following me, and they responded by saying that they just wanted to see what I do. I acted casual at first, laughing with my friends, some of them here, who were there with me. But we managed to get away from them and I returned home safely. However, it was when the hours went by did I truly understand the extent of this interaction. My family is dying. I went to a protest this reality and was intimidated and treated as a criminal. In all honesty, I broke down that day, for I realized that we are not only demanding an end to this genocide, but we are fighting an institution that is hell-bent on the psychological warfare against activists and supporters of the Palestinian people, all in an attempt to scare and silence us into submission. The title of this talk, of attempting to understand 76 years of colonization and asking what the situation is on the ground, is trying to understand that what we are doing here right now in Berlin at the Palestine Congress, this is the result of 76 years of colonization. Our presence here in our attempt to try and answer the questions of how we move forward, how we break free and fight for material substantial change in our homes. In 2017, I had the privilege, and yes, this may be a little bit of a flex, to speak on the same panel as Angela Davis in New York City. And this panel We attempted to tie the liberation struggles of Black people in America and within the prison industrial complex with the realities of Palestinians living under occupation. It was there I was exposed to connecting international movements to Palestinian liberation. It was there that I saw that the security systems that targeted Black activists in Ferguson were manufactured by state-owned companies in Israel, and arms sold to India from Israel were used to occupy and control Kashmir. And it was there I realized that those same weapons used to kill Palestinians were used by the Myanmar government to conduct a genocide against the Rohingya Muslims. And it wasn't that there was some international conspiracy that all points to Israel. No, what I understood from listening to someone like Angela Davis is that oppressors assist each other in controlling their populations, and Western hegemony is built through the subjugation and is in an internal cycle of keeping the downtrodden subdued. And it is here that I'd like to quote from her directly. Angela Davis says in her book, regimes of racial segregation were not disestablished because of the work of leaders and presidents and legislators, but rather because of the fact that ordinary people adopted a critical stance in the way in which they perceived their relationship to reality. Social realities that may have appeared inalterable, impenetrable, came to be viewed as malleable and transformable. And people learned how to imagine what it might mean to live in a world that was not so exclusively governed by the principle of white supremacy. This collective consciousness emerged within the context of social struggles. Here in Germany, the reason why there are hundreds of police, I wrote outside, but inside, and an intense state effort to silence us is because this social reality is malleable and transformable. The reason we're followed home by undercover police, beaten at protests and doxxed by the media is because we have developed a collective consciousness against the principle of white supremacy. It is because we actually understand how genocides of the past were able to happen. Can we confidently take a stand against the genocide of today? The dehumanization, the othering, the miscategorization and slandering of a people first leads to their occupation, but then eventually leads to their deaths. We are not attending an academic conference here today. We are resisting in one of the most powerful ways possible. We are facing the brunt of state repression head on and finally knocking on the sides of the water tank. Thank you, and free Palestine.